Did you know the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates Mexico's shale reserves to be 545 TCF of gas and 13.1 billion barrels of oil and condensate? Today we will discuss the history of Mexico's involvement in the oil and gas industry, Mexico's current involvement in the oil and gas industry, and prominent Mexican reserves.
Starting from the ages of the Aztecs and the Mayans, oil has played a prominent role in Mexico's heritage and culture. Throughout the years, their position as a top oil-producing country has remained quite constant and has kept their economy from collapsing many times. The first uses of oil was indeed by the Aztec people who used it not for fuel, but for a substitute for glue and as a coloring material for dyeing fabric. It wasn't until 1868 that a company discovered oil in Veracruz that the industry gained attention. Many foreign investors quickly built refineries to build kerosene off the land. By 1885, the oil industry was dominated by two men, Henry Pierce and Edward Donahue. They joined together to start the Mexican Petroleum Company. The company would go on to drill for the following 25 years and as well create the Cerro Azul well, which was the largest in the world for a good time. During the 1920s, Mexico was the second largest producer of oil. 60% of their production was from a company called Mexican Eagle, which would later become part of a Royal Dutch Shell. Another 30% was from American companies such as the Jersey Standard and the Standard Oil Company of California, which would later become Chevron. Because most of these companies producing and exporting oil were foreign, only a small percent of the profits actually stayed in Mexico. This increasing knowledge quickly spread throughout the country and soon formed a popular resentment against the foreign companies. By the early 1930s, the effects of the Great Depression hit the oil industry and Mexico's revenue started to decline. The Petroleum Workers Union of Mexico in 1935 demanded more rights for their workers, including contracts, time off, and a complete set of weekly hours. However, the companies did not pay any attention to the union's demand, as they had no power against them. However, 2 years later, the union grew stronger and together went on strike against their employers. The president ordered an investigation into the companies, in which they found that they did not make enough money to pay their workers more to meet the demand. In 1937, the Board of Mexico ruled in favor of the unions and charged the companies to meet their demands, as well as pay 26 million pesos to the lost salaries that the workers had not been paid. In 1938, the president signed the Mexican Oil Act. This stated that all oil and minerals found in Mexico now belonged solely to them. This also forced 14 of the companies out of the country. He also created Pemex, which had overall rights over all actions involving oil in Mexico. They also formed the Union of Oil Workers in the Mexican government, who would deal with the management and satisfaction of the workers and their managers. From 1940 to 1971, Mexico's average oil output increased to a successful 6%. Between 1940 and 1951, they increased from 44 million barrels to 79 million barrels. And by 1971, they had almost doubled this amount. These improvements were due to the discovery of the new wells farther down in Mexico, near Guatemala and the Gulf Coast. By 1975, Mexico's oil output once again exceeded internal demand, providing a margin for export. The president decided to start increasing the reserves and start paying off international loans. They soon received $12 million in credit, which they used to improve their rigs and reserves, employ more technicians, and invest in offshore operations. These operations remained pretty constant until 1985, when the oil revenue began to fall. The drop was due to decreased domestic needs and lower production. With the recession in 2006, Mexico took a huge turn for the worse as well. Over 700,000 jobs were lost, and their production output decreased by a huge 12%. Mexico has never quite recovered from this hit, and since then has gradually worked back to the previous state, but are now being passed by other Latin American countries, such as Brazil and Venezuela.
On August 12, 2014, Mexican President Enrique Pena Nieto put into law the ability for foreign oil companies to invest in Mexico.
specifically Pemex. The main motive, other than the profit, was to increase the skill to acquire shale and shale gas. The companies such as ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, and the US-based Chevron will get a share of the profit, not the raw crude. The problem with this is that the volatile market and oil price today makes it so that there's an unclear promise of profits. The people of Mexico also strongly oppose the privatization because it steals money that the government could otherwise use, and thus the pros and cons have to be balanced. Pemex is the largest oil and gas company in Mexico, and their competitor, Petrobras, will face a great challenge with competing with Mexico. Recently, Pemex's oil production is down and decreasing, and this is why fracking was prompted and private investment action took place. Hydraulic fracturing, aka fracking, is a major concern for Mexico and is a hot topic in many oil and gas discussions around the world. Fracking in its own sense is highly debated and involves large amounts of water, chemicals, human resources, and in turn has the risk for earthquakes and causes noise pollution.
The largest and most historically prolific oil field in Mexico is the Cantarell Field, located offshore in the Bay of Campeche, near the Yucatan Peninsula. The discovery well was first drilled by Pemex, the national oil company, in 1976, with first oil production beginning in 1979 and peak production of 2.1 million barrels per day in 2004. From first oil production until 2008, approximately 11 billion barrels have been produced, with an estimated 7 billion recoverable barrels remaining. Nitrogen injection as production enhancement has been utilized in the Cantarell field. However, perhaps Mexico's largest energy resource is the presence of onshore shale reserves. As alluded to in the beginning of this presentation, the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates Mexico's shale reserves to be 545 TCF of natural gas and 13.1 billion barrels of oil and condensate. This estimation makes Mexico's shale resources larger than any conventional Mexican reservoir. Unfortunately, due to the technological and capital limitations of Pemex, the national oil company of Mexico, these resources have failed to be developed to their potential. With the new ability of private investment in Mexico, these shale plays are expected to significantly contribute to the world energy market.
To recap, we discussed Mexico has battled with foreign investors to leading the oil industry and currently struggling to stay afloat as other Latin American countries begin to pass them in oil production. Currently, the President of Mexico recently passed legislation allowing private investment in Mexican reservoirs, giving Mexico the potential to fully develop their shale resources, in part due to other companies investing. Regarding Mexican reservoirs, Cantarell has been Mexico's most historically prolific reservoir. However, with its production decline, Mexico must look for additional energy from its undeveloped shale resources.